Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, November 6th, where I wanted to talk about Dracula and I also wanted to talk about registration. If you will see in the notes below, I've included a link for registration. I believe by this point you are probably aware that the schedule is available online, so you should be reaching out to your advisor to register for classes, though you can also register through our advising center. And through that link, you can see that you can do all kinds of searches, so you can get very detailed in terms of time or teacher or course. And I encourage you to register earlier rather than later. For obvious reasons, you'll get exactly what it is, what you want, when you want it, how you want it, if you register early. Though the reality is that you probably have up until the first week of the semester in which to register for classes. And my suspicion is that after this particular course, you might have satisfied a requirement in your liberal arts degree. If you're pursuing a liberal arts degree, that's what we call the 200 level literature class. But if you like English classes, you can take 6 of these 200 level English classes and graduate with a liberal arts degree with a concentration in English. And the nice thing about that is that you can change your mind at any point along the way, because most of the English classes, actually all of the English literature classes that you would take, could be used as electives in the pursuit of a liberal arts degree. And it was designed that way purposely so that you could move in and out of that concentration. I am the advisor for that, but you could talk to any member of the English faculty if you so wanted to. And in terms of what I will be teaching next semester, I will be teaching Shakespeare, also in an online format, very similar to this. And I will also be teaching my media and popular culture class in horror film. That's not an English class, it's a CMN class, CMN 201, and you can see that in the notes below. And right now, I believe it's listed as staff, but you can see the films that we cover. And there's some overlap with some of the texts that we've talked about this semester, including Dracula, very iconic horror film. But before I start to get into Dracula, I wanted to remind you that next class, Wednesday the 8th, we are supposed to be following a Friday schedule. So that means we have no classes on Wednesday. I'll be posting that on Moodle as well. And that gives you a little bit of extra time in which to catch up with Dracula. As you know, this is our longest novel. By this point, you should have submitted in paper number 1. If you haven't submitted in paper number 1, please reach out to me. I suspect it might take me a little bit longer than I had initially intended to evaluate paper number 1. There was a recent death in my family, but I will get paper number 1 back to you with enough time for you to revise it if you so elect to do so, because everybody has that option. And you can revise it and submit it in up until the very ending of the semester. Obviously, the sooner the better for everybody involved. I just ask that you submit in your revision along with the original graded copy so that I can compare and contrast the two. And then you get the higher of the 2 grades. So I see the first paper as a learning exercise. Your second paper is going to be very similar to the first paper. It'll just deal with the second set of readings, the readings that we are starting with Dracula onwards in the semester. And in terms of Dracula, you can see that we began with the very iconic 1931 film from Universal Studios. The 1930s was known as the heyday of the Universal Monster Studio. And in fact, Dracula is considered to be the first American horror film, which is something that I talk about in my medium popular culture class about horror film. 1931, this film came out, and Bela Lugosi ended up making the iconic character of Dracula his own. And in fact, reputedly, he learned the role phonetically because English was not his first language. It's one of the reasons for his very stilted delivery. And of course, this is what everybody thinks of when they think of Dracula. But Dracula was based on a novel by Bram Stoker from the 1800s in the Victorian period. That's what we will be focusing on. And The 1931 Bela Lugosi Dracula was not the first adaptation of that novel. There was an unlicensed bootleg adaptation done in 1922, a film that you might have heard of before, Nosferatu. Very important film in terms of the German expressionistic movement. And Bram Stoker's widow tried everything in her power to have every copy of Nosferatu destroyed because, again, it was unlicensed. Fortunately for us, she was unsuccessful. One copy survived, and that's why we have that great German expressionistic film. Dracula was also turned into a Broadway stage play, and many of the conventions of that stage play were used in the 1931 Universal Studios adaptation. For instance, the collar and the cape were important on the stage because they allowed an actor who would be standing over a trap door to descend into the trap door, and the collar and the cape would be arranged in such a way so that it would remain standing while the actor disappeared down the trap door, so that it would appear that the actor had disappeared invisibly. And they kept some of those conventions. Of course, when you think about the iconic image of Dracula, you always think about the cape and the collar. As you saw by watching the film, which is so true of many films, there is a collapsing of text, both with plots and characters. There are even some name changes. So this is something that we've seen before in other texts. So you're going to need to pay careful attention. Of course, Dracula is a very long text. So part of those changes, I think, were necessitated in terms of getting us a shorter storyline. Dracula is also told in the epistolary format. This is something else that we have seen before in previous texts. It's not a particularly easy format to translate over into film, so they took some liberties with the film. Originally, Dracula had no soundtrack. That gives it this kind of eerie feeling to it. We hear sound effects, in effect. The Gothic majestic sets are perhaps what Dracula is most well known for, that Gothic castle. And lots of Christian imagery. So if you were watching the film, you saw things like crosses and the table setting, for instance, when in this instance in the film, the name is Renfield, the real estate agent, but in the book it's Jonathan Harker. They ended up collapsing the two characters, Renfield and Jonathan Harker, in the film. But at any rate, when he first goes to Dracula's castle and he's sitting at the table, that table almost looks like a Christian altar. That's very deliberate. The idea that Dracula has wine served. In Christian mythology, wine is the blood of Christ and the blood is the life. Of course, that's an image that's embedded within the text. And Christianity is definitely promoted as Savior. The film code dictated that the monster had to be destroyed at the end, which is what we see with Dracula. In fact, it's a bit of a hurried ending as well, and I think it's because ultimately what we need to do is to make sure that we can have the hour and 15-minute or so runtime that we've come to expect in film, at least in 1930s film. But if you want to learn more about the film, I encourage you to take my horror film class. But our focus is on Bram Stoker's novel, and Stoker was very clever in using the idea of Dracul, which means son of the devil, this cruel Romanian medieval conqueror, for naming his vampire. And he was known for impaling his victims. In fact, there's a famous woodcut image where he's eating dinner and he is surrounded by the impaled heads of his victims. So he was known for his cruelty and also for impaling. And of course, that's embedded within the text of Dracula. There was also a serial killer in the 1500s by the name of Countess Bathory, and we usually think of serial killers as male rather than female, and she feasted on the blood of young girls. And of course, blood is so important in terms of maintaining youth and life within Dracula. So it's thought that Stoker was also inspired by that, as well as a short story by the name of The Vampire that was written by Dr. Polidori during a ghost story competition that produced, of all things, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So this was a very important night in the Gothic when Mary Shelley and her friends had challenged each other to writing a ghost story, because not only did Mary Shelley ultimately create Frankenstein, very important Gothic text, but we think that helped inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula as well. Now, the idea of the vampire myth has existed just about in all cultures. One of the earliest instances would be, at least in the United States, 1793, Vermont, which is right very near us. Now, the idea of vampirism wasn't that unusual if one thought about some of the symptoms of tuberculosis, which would have been raging at the time, where there would have been fatigue and paleness and a draining of the blood. We had already established with Edgar Allan Poe that it was indeed possible for an individual to be prematurely buried. So you add all of that together, and it's not a big stretch to come up with some of the iconic vampire lore. The text is quite long, as I indicated, but I think of it as 4 separate books, and I think that makes it much more manageable. That what I call book 1 would be chapters 1 through 4, and this is where we're introduced to the vampire. And what is surprising to many readers is how little we see of the vampire. In fact, another author, more contemporary author, Anne Rice, took great advantage of this by creating a story about vampire when she wrote about her vampire Lestat, the Vampire Chronicles. What I call book 2 is in effect a romance, and that's chapters 5 through 16. What I call book 3 is a mystery story, in effect, Mina's Mystery, and that's chapters, I would say, approximately 17 to 23. And chapter 4 is in effect an adventure story. That's chapter 22 to 25. I would say this was very clever from Stoker's perspective, because what he did was he gave us a lot of genres. So if we like the Gothic or supernatural genre, we will be particularly interested in the first 4 chapters. But if we're more interested in romances, we might be interested in chapters 5 through 16. If we are interested in mystery stories, and of course there's a good overlap in genre with the Gothic. After all, Edgar Allan Poe is credited with creating the first mystery story. That's chapters 17 through 23. And then finally, if you want some action adventure and an adventure story, that would be chapters 22 and 25. And this text is told in journals and letters and things like scrapbooks, which was a very common hobby for the upper classes in the Victorian period. It might seem a little bit antiquated, but then I think about how oftentimes we use social media accounts in order to be able to preserve things like photographic memories, and how often it is that we communicate via text or again via social media. So perhaps as much as things have changed, they've remained the same. And believe it or not, this book was actually longer. There was an additional chapter that was deleted, an introductory chapter entitled Dracula's Guest. You can see this in the notes below in the 5th section, that it was basically published as an independent short story. You're not required to read it, but if you are curious and you do want to read it, I've included the link to it. It just helps set a little bit more atmosphere with the vampire myth. One of the things we'll see in the first chapter in Dracula is the importance of technology for that time period. And technology is supposed to be associated with the West, which is supposed to be associated with civilization, rationality, the scientific method. So things like shorthand, for instance, would have been seen, or a typewriter would have been seen as cutting-edge technology. And the West, which would be places like England, would be in contrast to the East. That would be places like, let's say, Transylvania, which is supposed to be something that's uncivilized and irrational and fueled by superstition. This is established immediately when we're told that the trains don't run on time. When at this point, Jonathan Harker, notice last name, to hark, so basically this is somebody who will listen and tell. And we see how the foreign is presented as the other, something dangerous. Lots of xenophobia here with the idea of what exists in Eastern culture. It's a Gothic theme we've seen before. Lots of seemingly unimportant references to eating and appetite that are very important because the entire text is about eating and appetite, the eating and the appetite of the vampire, which is forever voracious. Um, at the very first page of our novel, we get a dinner reference, for instance, to sort of reinforce that idea. And the vampire has been read symbolically. So we can read it as a literal supernatural entity, but we can also read the vampire as a psychic vampire, somebody who lives off the energy of another. If we wanted to consider the 1800s, we could think about the vampire, specifically Dracula, as representative of the aristocracy who's living off of the lifeblood of the masses. This would have been a very resonant idea, or would have been a very powerful idea for 1930s audiences watching the film Dracula. Of course, we would have had the Depression at that particular point in time. And as I had suggested earlier, Dracula as representation of other, who's coming to corrupt the particularly females of Europe and contaminate bloodlines. And of course, the big issue is when Dracula begins attacking female aristocracy in the novel. St. George's Day is one of the days that's referenced in the first chapter. This is May 4th, and it's a day in which evil things are supposed to hold sway. So there are a good number of pagan references. In fact, one of the links that I'll be sharing with you soon will be a version of Dracula that you could read in real time over the course of a year, because you've probably noticed that this epistolary novel is divided up into basically daily entries. Obviously, we don't have the time to spend an entire year reading the novel in its entirety, but reading it in real time, something I've never done, but I've always wanted to do, seems like a fascinating way of being able to experience that story. Though I must admit that it was no mistake that Dracula just happens to coincide with Halloween. And I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about some of the folklore associated with Halloween, and also listening to a very traditional ghost story, The Monkey's Paw. Notice how subtle English ghost stories are in particular. We'll talk about ghost stories in further depth when we talk about The Haunting of Hill House. And as short as the story was, taking care of some imagery, the idea of the three wishes. Three oftentimes is associated with Trinity, so there's Christianity that's embedded in there. In fact, when we talk about Dracula, we'll talk about his three wives, oftentimes referenced as the unholy Trinity. Again, this is an examination of Christian mythology. This text, as much as anything else. The idea that we have the white family, of course, and the fact that they're playing games initially in the short story, The Monkey's Paw. Even the monkey is supposed to be associated with mischievousness and sometimes evil. So I don't know if you ever heard about A Hand of Glory, which could be referenced by The Monkey's Paw, and again associated with the supernatural and the ability to bring life from death. So lots of possible interpretations with that ghost story, but that's more of just an extra that I wanted to throw in there. That said, I wouldn't necessarily be averse to you writing a paper on The Monkey's Paw if you so wanted to. You just need to come up with a particular thesis. Your second paper will be very similar to your first paper. So I will be asking you about hauntings, but you can always come up with your own thesis as well. Just make sure that you have the topic approved by me ahead of time. At any rate, Chapter 2 is well known in Dracula for its establishing of Gothic mood and atmosphere. Again, I reference Halloween. You'd be hard-pressed to go to a Halloween party without seeing a Dracula somewhere or another. And this idea of the large, imposing castle. Keep in mind that the Gothic, the terminology, comes in part from architecture and those great Gothic cathedrals, which we see, I think, with that castle. That castle has no bell or knocker, and it's on the edge of a precipice. Again, the bell or no knocker, isolation. We already know isolation is a bad thing in the world of the Gothic, and definitely Jonathan Harker is going to be on the edge of a precipice when he enters there. It's nighttime, it's Transylvania. There's a library of English books that Dracula is studying, and he's buying British real estate. Again, a not so subtle reference to perhaps some of the fear in England of immigration and the possibility of the dilution of their culture and bloodlines. In chapter 3 is when we get Jonathan's imprisonment, and also page 46, reference to sexuality, particularly female sexuality. Now, we've talked about this a little bit with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and how the time period was one of great repression. Obviously, the vampire bite can be seen as erotic. Not only is there penetration involved, much like there is with traditional images of sexuality. But what is interesting is that on page 46, we see the tables turned, so to speak, where we have female as aggressor, and one could say that Jonathan is basically passive victim. I think Stephen King talked a little bit about this as well, and Danse Macabre, about the idea that certainly from a Victorian perspective, Jonathan couldn't be blamed because he's victim, he's not pursuer. At the time, this could be viewed as even a kind of soft porn episode, because it very much sounds like an episode of oral sex. Chapter 4, when we are told about the Count now wearing Jonathan's clothes, again, a not-so-veiled reference that the Count is trying to take over Jonathan's identity, literally and figuratively. And it ends in a cliffhanger. It's a literal cliffhanger because remember that the castle is on the edge of a precipice. But it also helps to establish the cliffhanger in stories where we want to know what's going to happen, and then we get a shift. And I think it's very clever, the kind of shift that we get in order to retain our attention, because this is where we find out about other characters. This is where we go to journals and letters, and we shift from Jonathan to Mina and Lucy. And Mina is supposed to represent the modern woman. She knows shorthand. She knows how to use a typewriter. She knows stenography. Yet she still wants to serve her husband, so there are very much those gender roles embedded in there. But she does express a certain level of independence, and as we will see, intellect. And Lucy also is a modern woman, but in a different way. She is contemplating 3 suitors. Notice that number 3 again, suggestions of Trinity. And she laments the fact that she can't have all 3, which is a rather progressive idea for the time period. Note that Lucy is the one who's killed in this novel, not Mina. Spoiler alert here. I hope I'm not giving away too much of the ending if you have not finished Dracula. In part, this is that, embedded Gothic idea that sexuality, especially female sexuality, is punished. We see this trope also in horror movies as well. And we're introduced to Quincy Morris. He's an American, specifically a Texan, and he's a foreigner. I don't think it's any mistake that he also is killed by the ending of the novel. Again, spoiler alert here. Dr. Seward, who's supposed to represent a professional, hence his title of doctor. We talked about this a little bit with Dr. Jekyll. Arthur Holmwood, he's supposed to represent the aristocracy. It isn't a cheap endeavor just to take off weeks or months at a time to chase a vampire. So he provides the financing, if nothing else. He also is the person that Lucy picks, and we could say that she picks him out of love, or we could say that she picks him out of practicality, because there's a good amount of money associated with choosing that individual. Renfield, this is the character that's collapsed with Jonathan in the film. Renfield is an insane asylum patient. He's part of what Stephen King would call the gross out, as we see him consuming live insects, and ultimately the idea of consuming life in order to get life. Look for puns in this novel. There's a certain level of dark humor in there. For instance, in chapter 5, we're told that you can count on me. Think about how that's a reference to Count Dracula. In chapter 6, we find out that Lucy has been spending her time at the grave of a suicide. Again, this is all establishing all of the possibilities. A suicide is supposed to be the one unforgivable sin in Christianity. In other words, this would allow access to a Dracula, who is basically evil personified. This is where we get some of the also scenes of Renfield consuming these insects as he's going up the food chain and consuming more complex life forms. Of course, the ultimate complex life form would be a human being, which is what Dracula consumes. Also notice, too, the idea of how Dracula's 3 wives, so to speak, pursue Jonathan without Dracula's permission, and Dracula makes it very clear that they aren't to take action without his permission. So I think there's some interesting gender commentary in there as well. Chapter 7 is when we're introduced to the idea of the Victorian scrapbook and also the ship arrival of the Demeter. One of my favorite scenes just happens to be the ship captain, and we learn this through his logs that his crew has been disappearing. Obviously, Dracula's coffin is there, and Dracula is coming out at night, and he's living off of the sailors. But the ship captain is there, tied to his wheel with his rosary beads. I find that personally to be a rather chilling image. Chapter 8 is where we're told about things like women's appetites. And again, think about how an appetite can be in reference not just for food, but also consumerism and sexuality as well. And that a couple should be able to see themselves asleep before engagement. And that's also a very radical idea. The idea that consummation of a relationship did not happen until after marriage. Again, more punning. You'll see that in chapter 8. You don't count now. So expect those little winks and nods from Brad Stoker. Chapter 9, we're introduced to Van Helsing. He's a man who's able to merge both science and religion. And that's one of the lessons that's embedded within this particular text, that as advanced as science is, spirituality, religion, and supernatural elements that cannot be explained through natural means also have a place in the world. And we learn a little bit about backstory about how Van Helsing and Dr. Seward first met. Dr. Seward, years ago, had sucked poison from Van Helsing's wound after he had been bitten. And, of course, this entire novel is about sucking. Chapter 10 through 12 is where we have Lucy at this point, who is becoming more and more drained of her life force through Dracula, getting blood infusions from the men. And we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief here, because I know that there are things such as blood types. That's nothing that's discussed within the novel. It's just assumed that all of these men are matches. It helps to reinforce the idea about Lucy taking in the life force of 3 men. In this instance, blood, but it could certainly be a symbol as well for something like semen. After all, she had contemplated 3 suitors. And the consequences of taking in someone's life force, particularly a female taking in the life forces of males, that ultimately she will be punished for that. Chapter 12, we see that Quincy, in a fit, had shot a vampire bat. It's a little bit of foreshadowing there. And also it shows how Quincy is a bit of the rash one, the rash Texan, part of the stereotype, perhaps, of the rash American. This is where we're also introduced to Lucy's death, which I have in quotation marks because, as we find out, she's not dead. She's become the undead. And chapter 13, just to give you an idea of the importance of decorum in the Victorian period. At this point, Mina is talking about how improper it is for her husband, at this point, Jonathan, to hold her arm in public. So this gives you an idea of how affection or any kind of intimacy was viewed as taboo during the time period. And Seward says that if America keeps breeding men like Quincy, it'll be a world power. And I think that's some of the fear about the rising power of America. And one might say that England was indeed right when we think about what happened politically in the 1900s with England and the United States. In chapter 14, Van Helsing talks a little bit about his lonely life. And we always know isolation is a negative thing in the world of the Gothic. And in fact, it's because these characters are able to form a sense of community and unite that they're able to ultimately defeat Dracula. Spoiler alert here. And in chapter 15 to 16, this is where the men ultimately kill Lucy. They stake Lucy. Of course, the stake could be a symbol or a metaphor for something like a phallus. And Stephen King talked about this as well, that the language is quite erotic. It almost seems orgasmic in some instances. And again, in a society in which one could not talk about sex, there are lots of ways that one could read this novel and find it to be erotic, yet not necessarily have to say that one was reading an erotic novel. So I think that was very clever on Stoker's part. So I'll stop here, and then we can continue on next class talking about, starting with chapter 17. For our attendance question, this would be due on Wednesday the 8th. And I'm also a little bit behind with getting to the attendance questions, but I will catch up. I thought I'd ask you at this particular point, what do you think of the novel thus far? Are you finding the novel to be a Gothic novel that is satisfying in one way or another? That said, again, I remind you that you should be coming to the ending of Dracula. The good news is that what we will find is that the readings that come after Dracula, I think, are going to be a bit more accessible. And certainly I think they will be, if for no other reason, they're more contemporary. And I think you'll also find that they will be shorter in length as well. So do register for classes. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Dracula. Take care. Bye-bye.